The September sun beat down mercilessly on Commerce Street in downtown San Antonio, turning the asphalt into a shimmering mirror of heat. Tourists clutched their shopping bags from the Riverwalk boutiques, hurrying between patches of shade while business people rushed past with their eyes glued to smartphones. The afternoon rush created a symphony of car horns, distant mariachi music from nearby restaurants, and the constant hum of conversation in both English and Spanish. Daniel Rivera stood on the corner of Commerce and Navarro, his worn Bible open in his weathered hands. At 19, he looked older than his years, his face tanned and lined from months of sleeping rough, his dark hair grown long and tangled beneath a faded Texas Ranger's cap. His clothes, donated from a shelter on West Martin Street, hung loosely on his thin frame. A cardboard sign leaned against the brick wall behind him. Not asking for money, just sharing hope. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord." Daniel's voice rang out, clear and strong despite the noise around him. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. His voice carried a natural resonance that made people glance up from their phones, even if just for a moment before hurrying on. Most people avoided eye contact. Some crossed to the other side of the street. A few dropped coins into the battered coffee can at his feet, despite his sign, their faces touched with pity. Daniel had been doing this for 3 months now, ever since he'd found his mother's Bible in his backpack, one of the few possessions he'd managed to keep after losing everything. Before that, he'd spent his first 3 months on the streets in a haze of grief and anger, sleeping in Brackenridge Park and avoiding the shelters where questions were asked and sympathy offered. "You're wasting your breath, kid," called out Robert Chen, the owner of the corner coffee shop, as he swept the sidewalk in front of his establishment. Robert was in his 50s, with silver threading through his black hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd grown accustomed to Daniel's presence over the past months. Nobody stops anymore. Everyone's too busy. Daniel offered a tired smile. "Maybe just one person needs to hear it today, Mr. Chen. That's enough." Robert shook his head, but didn't argue. He'd tried to offer Daniel work washing dishes, but the young man had refused. Something about not deserving stability yet, though Robert couldn't understand why. The afternoon wore on. Daniel's throat grew dry, but he continued. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. He thought, as he often did, about his parents. His father, Miguel Rivera, had been a high school music teacher in Houston. His mother, Elena, had worked as a nurse at Memorial Hermann. They'd encouraged his musical dreams, paid for his first semester at Berklee College of Music in Boston. Then came that February night, the drunk driver who ran the red light on I-10, the phone call that shattered his world, the guilt that consumed him, guilt that he'd been in Boston, living his dream, while they drove home from a parent-teacher conference. Guilt that the last conversation he'd had with his father had been an argument about money and career choices. He'd dropped out 3 weeks after the funeral, couldn't stand the sight of a piano, couldn't bear to sing anything but scripture. The insurance money had gone to debts and funeral costs. His parents' house had been rented, and Daniel had left Houston, unable to face the memories. He'd hitchhiked to San Antonio, drawn by some instinct he couldn't name, perhaps because his father had grown up here, had talked about it as home. "Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow," Daniel continued, his voice softer now as the crowd thinned in the late afternoon heat. "For tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." A black Chevrolet Silverado pulled up to the curb across the street, parking in front of a Western wear store. Daniel barely noticed, focused on a young woman who'd stopped a few feet away, tears streaming down her face. She was maybe 30, professionally dressed, her makeup smudged. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Daniel asked gently, stepping toward her. She nodded, fumbling in her purse. I needed to hear that today. About tomorrow. I just lost my job and I don't know how I'm going to—" She trailed off, pressing a $20 bill into his hand. "Please, I can't take this," Daniel said, trying to hand it back. "You need it more than—" "You gave me something more valuable," she said, her voice steadier now. "Thank you." She walked away quickly, wiping her eyes. Daniel stood there, the bill crumpled in his hand, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. He could help strangers with words, but he couldn't help himself, couldn't forgive himself, couldn't move forward. He didn't notice the man who'd been standing across the street for the past 10 minutes, leaning against the Silverado with his arms crossed. The man wore dark jeans, a pressed white shirt, and a cream-colored Resistol cowboy hat that shaded his weathered face. He was in his 70s, but stood tall and straight, watching Daniel with an intensity that would have made the young man uncomfortable had he noticed. George Strait had driven into San Antonio from his ranch in Cotulla for a meeting with his longtime producer. The meeting had ended early, and he'd decided to walk around downtown for a bit, something he rarely did anymore. Fame had its price, and even after all these years, he couldn't go many places without being recognized. He'd been about to get back in his truck when he heard the voice. Clear, strong, passionate. He turned to see the young man on the corner, Bible in hand, preaching to people who mostly ignored him. There was something in the kid's voice that stopped George in his tracks. Not just the quality of it, though that was remarkable, but the raw emotion behind the words. George had listened to 3 different passages, watching how Daniel's entire being seemed to pour into what he was saying. This wasn't performance. This was genuine. And that voice, there was training there, natural talent refined by practice. George had been in the music business for over 40 years. He knew a gifted voice when he heard one. When the young woman walked away, and Daniel stood there looking lost despite the money in his hand, George made a decision. He adjusted his hat, checked for traffic, and crossed the street. Daniel was putting the $20 bill in his pocket, trying to decide whether to use it for food or save it for when the weather turned cold, when a shadow fell across him. "Son, that was quite something." Daniel looked up and froze. Even with the hat shadowing his face, there was no mistaking George Strait. The strong jawline, the kind eyes, the distinctive voice that Daniel had heard on countless records. His father had been a huge fan, had played Amarillo by Morning so many times that Daniel could sing it in his sleep. Mr. Strait?" Daniel's voice came out as barely a whisper. George smiled, extending his hand. "Just George is fine. What's your name?" "Daniel. Daniel Rivera." He shook George's hand, aware of how rough his own palm must feel, how dirty his clothes were. "I'm sorry. I must look." "You look like someone who's been through something hard," George said simply. "How long have you been out here?" Daniel's defenses went up automatically. "I'm not asking for handouts. The sign says—" "I can read," George said gently. "I'm not offering charity. I'm asking a question because I'm interested. That voice of yours, you've had training." Daniel looked away, his jaw tightening. "That was a long time ago. Doesn't sound like it. You've got technique, control, even standing out here in this heat." George glanced at the Bible in Daniel's hands. "Why scripture? Why not songs?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. He felt his throat constrict, the familiar wave of guilt and pain washing over him. Because songs are for people who deserve to make music. Scripture is for people who need redemption. George was quiet for a moment, studying the young man's face. He saw the pain there, the self-punishment. He'd seen it before, in his own mirror, years ago after his daughter Jennifer had died in a car accident in 1986. He knew that look. The look of someone who blamed themselves for something beyond their control. "Mind if I ask what happened?" George said softly. "My parents died. Car accident. I was supposed to be there, but I was in Boston at music school, living my dream while they—" Daniel's voice broke. He cleared his throat, angry at himself for showing weakness. "I don't deserve to make music anymore." "That's the grief talking, not the truth," George said. "Your parents would want—" "You didn't know them." Daniel's voice was harsh now, defensive. "You don't know what they'd want." George nodded, not taking offense. "You're right. I didn't know them. But I know what it's like to lose someone in a car accident. I know what it's like to carry guilt that isn't yours to carry. And I know that punishing yourself doesn't honor their memory. It just wastes the life they gave you." Daniel felt tears burning behind his eyes. He blinked them back furiously. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." "Because 30 years ago, someone stopped when I was at my lowest and told me something similar," George said. "Because that voice of yours is a gift, and I can't walk away from someone wasting it out of misplaced guilt. And because—" he paused, choosing his words carefully, "because sometimes we cross paths with people for a reason." Robert Chen had stopped sweeping and was watching the exchange with wide eyes, recognizing George Strait and wondering what was happening. "What do you want from me?" Daniel asked, his voice wary. "Nothing. I want to offer you something. Tomorrow night, I'm doing a small, private thing at First Baptist Church on West Avenue. Just me, an acoustic guitar, and some songs for the congregation. Pastor William Jennings invited me months ago. It's not a concert. It's more like a service with music." George reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. "I'd like you to come. Not to perform. Just to come. See what faith and music can look like together." Daniel stared at the card. It was simple, cream-colored, with just a name and phone number. "I don't understand why—" "You don't have to understand. Just show up. 6 o'clock. There'll be dinner before the service. You look like you could use a good meal." George's tone was matter-of-fact, not pitying. "I don't go to churches anymore," Daniel said quietly. "I can't sit in those pews and pretend I'm worthy of—" "Nobody's worthy, son. That's the whole point." George put his hand on Daniel's shoulder briefly. "Just think about it. The offer stands whether you come or not." George started to walk back toward his truck, then turned. "Daniel, your parents sent you to music school because they believed in you. The best way to honor them isn't to throw away what they invested in. It's to use it. Even if it's just sharing scripture on a street corner, you're using that voice. But I think you're capable of more. I think they knew you were capable of more." With that, George crossed back to his truck, got in, and drove away, leaving Daniel standing on the corner with a business card in one hand and his mother's Bible in the other. Robert Chen approached cautiously. "Was that really George Strait?" "Yeah," Daniel said, still staring at the card. "What did he want?" "I'm not sure," Daniel admitted, "but I think he just offered me something I don't deserve." "Maybe that's exactly why he offered it," Robert said wisely. "The things we need most are usually the things we think we don't deserve." As the sun began to set over San Antonio, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Daniel tucked the card carefully into his Bible and wondered if maybe, just maybe, tomorrow could be different than today. That night, sleeping in his usual spot under the Commerce Street Bridge, Daniel dreamed of his father teaching him to play guitar, his mother's voice singing along in their kitchen in Houston. When he woke before dawn, the business card was still clutched in his hand. The next evening, Daniel stood outside First Baptist Church of San Antonio. his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The historic building rose before him, its red brick facade and white columns illuminated by the setting sun. Cars filled the parking lot, and well-dressed people streamed through the main entrance, their laughter and conversation creating a wall of sound that made Daniel want to turn and run. He'd spent the entire day debating whether to come. He'd used some of the money from yesterday to buy a second-hand shirt and pants from a thrift store on South Flores Street. And he'd cleaned up as best he could in the restroom of the public library. But standing here now, watching families and couples enter the church, he felt the vast distance between their world and his. "You look lost, young man." Daniel turned to find an elderly woman standing beside him. She was African American, probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and kind eyes that reminded him painfully of his grandmother. She wore a purple dress and carried a covered dish that smelled like heaven. "I'm not sure I should be here," Daniel admitted. "Well, that's usually the best reason to come inside," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Dorothy Hamilton. I've been a member here for 43 years, and I can promise you that church is exactly where uncertain people belong." "Daniel Rivera," he said, offering his hand. "Nice to meet you, Daniel. Are you here for the service?" "George Strait invited me." "But I don't—" "George invited you?" Dorothy's eyes lit up. "Well then, you're definitely in the right place. Come on, dinner's already started in the fellowship hall. You can meet everyone before the service." Before Daniel could protest, Dorothy had linked her arm through his and was gently steering him toward a side entrance. "Don't look so terrified. We're Baptists, not cannibals. Well, mostly." She winked, and despite himself, Daniel felt a small smile tug at his lips. The fellowship hall was a large, brightly lit room with round tables covered in white tablecloths. The smell of home-cooked food filled the air. Fried chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, cornbread, and various casseroles. Daniel's stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. About 75 people filled the room, their voices creating a comfortable buzz of conversation. Daniel spotted George immediately, standing near the stage at the far end of the room, talking with a man in pastoral robes. George caught his eye and smiled, nodding in acknowledgement, but not calling attention to him. "Let's get you fed," Dorothy said, leading him to the buffet line. "Then I'll introduce you around. Don't worry, I won't let the pastor corner you right away. Pastor Bill means well, but he can be a bit intense for newcomers." Daniel filled his plate, trying not to take too much despite his hunger. Dorothy watched him with knowing eyes and added an extra piece of chicken to his plate. "Take more. There's plenty, and leftovers just go to waste." They sat at a table near the back, and Dorothy immediately began introducing him to other church members. There was Harold Peterson, a retired firefighter with a handlebar mustache who'd been with the church for 30 years. Jessica Warner, a schoolteacher in her 40s who taught Sunday school for the teenagers. Thomas and Rebecca Flynn, a young couple with a baby who'd just joined the church 6 months ago. Everyone was friendly, but Daniel could see the questions in their eyes. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why was he here? He kept his answers vague, and Dorothy, bless her, seemed to sense his discomfort and steered conversations away from personal topics. "Daniel's a friend of George's," she said simply, and that seemed to be enough explanation for most people. As Daniel ate, trying not to wolf down the food despite his hunger, he observed the room. These people genuinely seemed to care about each other. He watched as an older man helped a woman in a wheelchair get her food, saw teenagers laughing with elderly couples, noticed how naturally people included a young man who seemed to have developmental disabilities, treating him as a valued member of the community rather than an outsider. It reminded him painfully of his childhood church in Houston before his parents died. before he'd decided that God either didn't exist or didn't care. "Daniel?" He looked up to find George standing beside the table, acoustic guitar in hand. Up close, without the hat shadowing his face, George looked his age, lines around his eyes, gray threading through his dark hair. But there was a vitality about him, a groundedness that came from someone who knew exactly who he was. "I'm glad you came," George said simply. "How was dinner?" "Best meal I've had in 6 months," Daniel admitted honestly. George nodded, understanding more than Daniel said. "Good. Pastor Bill wants to start in about 10 minutes. I'm doing 5 songs, and he'll speak between them. It's pretty informal." He hesitated, then added, "Afterward, I'd like to talk with you, if you're willing." "Okay," Daniel said, though his stomach tightened with anxiety. As George walked away to tune his guitar, Dorothy leaned over. "That man has one of the biggest hearts in Texas, and that's saying something. Whatever he's offering you, I suggest you listen." "How do you know he's offering me anything?" "Because I've known George since he started coming here 15 years ago, after he moved back to Texas full-time. He doesn't do anything halfway, especially when it comes to people who need help. And honey, no offense, but you have 'need help' written all over you." Daniel wanted to be offended but couldn't find the energy. She was right. People began moving from the fellowship hall into the main sanctuary. Daniel followed the crowd, Dorothy staying protectively by his side. The sanctuary was beautiful in its simplicity. High ceilings, dark wood pews, stained glass windows that caught the evening light. A simple wooden cross hung behind the altar, and George's guitar case rested on a stool beside a microphone stand. Dorothy led Daniel to a pew about halfway up. The sanctuary filled quickly, and Daniel noticed that this wasn't the typical Sunday crowd. These were dedicated members, people who came to a Wednesday evening service because they wanted to, not out of obligation. Pastor William Jennings walked to the pulpit. He was in his early 60s, with silver hair, warm brown eyes behind rimless glasses, and the bearing of a man who carried authority lightly. He wore simple pastoral robes and smiled broadly at the congregation. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this special evening of worship and music. As many of you know, George Strait has been a friend of this church for many years, and when I asked him if he'd share some music with us in a more intimate setting than his usual venues, he graciously agreed." He smiled at George, who nodded from his seat near the stage. "Tonight isn't about performance," Pastor Jennings continued. "It's about worship. It's about letting music and message work together to speak to our hearts. So I ask that you approach this evening with open hearts and minds, ready to hear what God might be saying to you through song and scripture." He gestured to George, who stood and picked up his guitar. The sanctuary fell silent. George settled onto the stool, adjusted the microphone, and began to play. The opening chords of "I Saw God Today" filled the sanctuary, and Daniel felt his breath catch. It was one of his father's favorite songs. George's voice, even without studio production, was remarkable. Warm, clear, emotionally resonant. But what struck Daniel most was the sincerity. This wasn't a performance. George meant every word he sang. Just walked down the street to the coffee shop, had to take a break. I'd been by her side for 18 hours straight. Saw a flower growing in the middle of the sidewalk, pushing up through the concrete, like it was planted right there for me to see. Daniel listened, memories flooding back. His mother in the hospital when he was 10, recovering from surgery. His father taking him for walks to get coffee, pointing out small miracles, birds, flowers, kindness between strangers, reminding him that God was present even in scary times. The doctor said the baby would be here any day. I saw God today. Tears streamed down Daniel's face, and he didn't try to hide them. Dorothy quietly passed him a tissue. Between songs, Pastor Jennings would read a short scripture passage and offer a brief reflection. After the third song, Love Without End, Amen, he spoke about parental love as a reflection of God's love. Our earthly fathers, imperfect as they are, give us a glimpse of how God loves us, Pastor Jennings said, unconditionally, without keeping score, with grace that exceeds our understanding. And when we lose those fathers, we don't lose that love. It lives on in memory, in the lessons they taught us, in the people we become because they believed in us. Daniel felt like the words were aimed directly at him, though he knew that was impossible. Pastor Jennings didn't even know he was there. The fifth and final song was Carrying Your Love With Me. George sang it looking out at the congregation, but Daniel could have sworn his eyes lingered on him for a moment during the chorus. Baby, all I gotta do is close my eyes, and I've got you with me. I can feel your heartbeat. I can hear you breathing. I can feel your warm touch. And when I'm holding you close, I know. When the song ended, the sanctuary was silent for a long moment. Then Pastor Jennings stood and walked to the pulpit. George, thank you. That was a gift. He looked out at the congregation. I want to talk for a moment about wasted gifts, about talents we bury because we don't think we're worthy of them, about dreams we abandon because we believe our pain disqualifies us from purpose. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, wondering if Dorothy had somehow communicated his story. I've counseled many people over my 30 years in ministry, Pastor Jennings continued, and one of the saddest things I encounter is people who believe that grief or guilt means they must punish themselves forever. People who think that because they've suffered loss, they must refuse joy, that because someone they loved is gone, they must stop living fully. He paused, letting the words sink in. But that's not what our loved ones would want. That's not what God wants. When we waste the gifts we've been given, whether they're gifts of music, teaching, compassion, or any other talent, we're not honoring anyone's memory. We're just creating more waste, more loss, more grief in the world. Daniel felt his hands trembling. He gripped the edge of the pew. If you're here tonight and you're carrying that kind of burden, Pastor Jennings said, his voice gentle but firm, I want you to hear this. You are not responsible for things beyond your control. Your pain is real, but it doesn't define your worth. Your guilt is understandable, but it's not truth. And the gifts you carry are not rewards for being perfect. They're tools for serving others, for bringing light into darkness, for connecting people to something larger than themselves. After a closing prayer, people began to mill about, many approaching George to thank him. Daniel sat frozen in the pew, unable to move. Dorothy sat beside him, saying nothing, just being present. Finally, as the crowd thinned, George approached their pew. Daniel, could we talk? There's a small office down the hall where we could have some privacy. Daniel nodded mutely and followed George down a hallway to a small office lined with bookshelves. Pastor Jennings was already there, and Daniel's stomach dropped. This felt like an intervention. Daniel, this is Pastor Bill Jennings, George said. I asked him to join us because I wanted you to know that this isn't just me making promises I can't keep. This is a community willing to help if you'll let us. Help with what? Daniel asked, his defenses rising. I'm fine. Son, you're sleeping rough, preaching on street corners, and punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault, Pastor Jennings said kindly but directly. That's not fine. George told you about me?" Daniel felt betrayed. "He told me you're a young man with an incredible gift who's lost his way after losing his parents," the pastor said. "He didn't share details, but I've been doing this long enough to recognize the signs of someone who's drowning." Daniel stood abruptly. "I didn't come here for therapy or charity. I came because—" He trailed off, not sure why he'd come. "You came because something in you is still fighting," George said quietly. "Something in you heard my invitation and said yes, even though another part of you wanted to say no. That's hope, Daniel. That's your spirit refusing to give up, even when your mind has." Daniel stood there, torn between running and staying. The kindness in their faces was almost harder to bear than indifference would have been. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "I want you to let us help you get back on your feet," George said. "I want you to consider that maybe your parents' deaths don't mean your dreams have to die, too. I want you to think about the possibility that you could honor their memory better by living fully than by merely surviving." "I can't," Daniel's voice broke. "I can't just move on like they didn't matter." "Nobody's asking you to move on," Pastor Jennings said gently. "We're asking you to move forward. There's a difference. Moving on suggests forgetting. Moving forward means carrying their memory with you while still living your life." Daniel sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. "I don't know how to do that." "That's okay," George said. "Nobody expects you to figure it out alone. That's what community is for." There was a long silence. Finally, Daniel looked up. "What are you proposing exactly?" George and Pastor Jennings exchanged glances. "First, stable housing," the pastor said. "We have a small apartment above the church offices. It's usually used for visiting missionaries, but it's empty right now. You could stay there, no cost, while you get on your feet." "I can't accept charity," Daniel started. "It's not charity if you work for it," George interjected. "Pastor Bill mentioned they need someone to help maintain the church grounds, some administrative work, set up for events, 20 hours a week. Minimum wage. It wouldn't be much, but it'd be honest work and a legitimate reason to accept the housing." Daniel's mind reeled. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." "Because 15 years ago, my daughter died in a car accident," George said quietly. "She was 13, and for a long time after that, I stopped making music, stopped believing in much of anything. Someone from this church reached out to me, offered me a community when I was isolating myself. They saved my life, in a way. I'm just paying forward what was given to me." Daniel stared at George, seeing the pain in the older man's eyes that mirrored his own. How did you start making music again?" "I realized that Jennifer would have hated knowing her death silenced me," George said. "She loved hearing me sing, loved music, and I was dishonoring her memory by refusing to do the thing she loved most about her dad. So I went back to it. Not because the pain went away, but because love is stronger than pain." Daniel felt something crack inside him, a barrier he'd built around his heart. "I'm scared," he whispered. "That's the most honest thing you've said tonight," Pastor Jennings replied. "And that's okay. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing despite the fear." "Can I think about it?" Daniel asked. "Of course," George said. "But while you're thinking, I want you to spend tonight in that apartment. Just one night. See what it feels like to have a bed, a shower, a space that's yours. If you decide tomorrow you'd rather go back to the streets, nobody will stop you." Daniel hesitated, then nodded slowly. "One night," Pastor Jennings smiled. "That's all we're asking. One night, one day, one step at a time. That's how faith works." That's how healing works. As they walked Daniel up to the small apartment, a simple space with a bed, kitchenette, bathroom, and sitting area, Dorothy appeared with a care package of leftovers and basic toiletries. "Thought you might need these," she said, pressing them into his hands. "And Daniel, whatever you decide tomorrow, know that you're welcome here. No conditions, no expectations. Just welcome." After everyone left, Daniel stood in the center of the apartment, overwhelmed. He set down the care package and walked to the window, looking out over the San Antonio skyline. The city lights sparkled like fallen stars. He thought about his father's favorite phrase, "Mijo, God doesn't give us gifts to bury them. He gives them to share them." He'd said it whenever Daniel hesitated to perform, whenever self-doubt crept in. Daniel opened his mother's Bible, the one constant companion from his old life, and found a letter tucked inside, one he'd read 100 times. His mother had written it during his first week at Berkeley. "My beloved Daniel, I am so proud of you. Your father and I have sacrificed gladly to give you this opportunity because we believe in you. We believe in your gift. Whatever happens in life, whatever challenges you face, don't hide your light. The world needs your voice, your music, your heart. We love you always." Mama Daniel read the words again, tears streaming down his face. For the first time in 6 months, he allowed himself to truly cry. Not the bitter tears of guilt, but the cleansing tears of grief. He cried for his parents, for his lost dreams, for the months he'd wasted punishing himself. And when he finally stopped crying, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the faintest glimmer of possibility. That night, sleeping in a real bed for the first time in months, Daniel dreamed not of the accident, but of his mother singing in the kitchen, his father's hands teaching him guitar chords, and their faces smiling at him, not with disappointment, but with love. Daniel woke to sunlight streaming through the apartment window and, for a disorienting moment, forgot where he was. The soft mattress beneath him, the clean sheets, the absence of traffic noise and other homeless people's voices, it all felt surreal. He sat up slowly, his body aching in different ways than it had on the streets. This was the ache of actual rest, of muscles finally relaxing after months of tension. He showered for the first time in weeks, truly showered, not the quick rinse-offs in public restrooms or the occasional use of the shelter facilities. The hot water felt like luxury beyond measure. He stood under the stream until it began to cool, watching months of street grime wash away, wishing his guilt could dissolve as easily. There was a knock on the door just as he finished dressing. He opened it to find Dorothy Hamilton standing there with a covered plate. "Thought you might want some breakfast," she said cheerfully. "I made extra biscuits and gravy this morning. Don't tell me you're not hungry. I raised 4 boys, and I know what a young man's appetite looks like." Despite himself, Daniel smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Hamilton." "Dorothy, please. Mrs. Hamilton is my mother-in-law, and we barely speak." She swept into the apartment and set the plate on the small table. "Eat up, and then Pastor Bill wants to see you. No pressure about the job offer, he just wants to show you what the work would entail if you're interested." As Daniel ate, the biscuits and gravy were incredible. Dorothy sat across from him, her manner comfortable and undemanding. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said between bites. "Why is everyone being so nice to me? You don't know me. I could be anyone." Dorothy considered this. "True, but George vouched for you, and that man has good instincts about people. Plus, I watched you at dinner last night. The way you tried not to take too much food, even though you were clearly starving. The way you said thank you and please like your mama taught you right. The way you cried during the service. That tells me enough. What does it tell you? That you're a good person going through a hard time, and that you're not used to asking for help, which means you'll work twice as hard when someone gives it to you. She smiled. Am I wrong? No, Daniel admitted quietly. Pastor Jennings appeared an hour later to give Daniel a tour of the church. In the daylight, Daniel could see the full scope of the property, the main sanctuary, the fellowship hall, a newer education wing with classrooms for Sunday school, and extensive grounds with gardens, a playground, and a small parking lot. The previous groundskeeper retired 3 months ago, Pastor Jennings explained as they walked the perimeter. We've been using a rotation of volunteers, but it's not sustainable. The work would be mainly mowing, weeding, basic maintenance. We also need someone to help set up for events, arranging chairs, setting up audio equipment, that sort of thing. And occasionally, some administrative work in the office. Filing, answering phones, basic computer tasks. I can do all of that, Daniel said. My dad taught me groundskeeping when I was a kid, and I did office work one summer in college. Good. Pastor Jennings paused by the garden, where roses bloomed in rich colors. Daniel, I want to be clear about something. This job is real. You're not getting it because we pity you. You're getting it because we need someone, and you're capable. The apartment is part of the compensation package. Fair exchange for fair work. Understood? Yes, sir. Good. Now, there's something else we need to discuss. The pastor's expression grew more serious. This Sunday, there's a church council meeting. It's our monthly gathering where various members discuss church business, upcoming events, budget concerns, that kind of thing. George mentioned to me that he'd like to bring up the possibility of starting a music outreach program. Daniel's stomach tightened. What does that have to do with me? George thinks you could be part of it. Not right away, but eventually. He envisions something where we bring music into the community. Nursing homes, shelters, community centers. Using music to reach people who might not step foot in a church otherwise. That sounds great, but I'm not. He thinks you could help lead it once you're ready. Your voice, your training, your own experience with hardship, it would all be valuable. Pastor Jennings held up a hand as Daniel started to protest. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm just letting you know what's coming. Because I need to be honest with you. Not everyone on the council is going to be enthusiastic about this idea. Why not? Pastor Jennings sighed. Because churches, like any organization, have politics. There are council members who believe we should focus our resources on traditional programs, who think outreach should look a certain way. And there are a couple of people who are, he chose his words carefully, skeptical about newcomers, especially ones who come from difficult circumstances. You mean they won't want a homeless person representing their church? Daniel said bluntly. I mean, they'll need to be convinced that you're serious about rebuilding your life, and that this isn't just George being impulsive with church resources. The pastor's tone was kind but honest. I'm telling you this because I believe in transparency. If you decide to stay, if you decide to eventually be part of this outreach program, you'll face questions and doubts. I want you prepared for that. Daniel appreciated the honesty, even as it made his anxiety spike. Who are these council members? You'll meet them soon enough. But the two you should be aware of are Richard Montgomery and Patricia Hayes. Richard's been a member here for 25 years. He's a successful real estate developer, very generous with his donations, and very traditional in his views. Patricia's been here almost as long. She's a retired school principal, very concerned with the church's reputation and image. They sound like they run the place, Daniel observed. They have significant influence, Pastor Jennings admitted. But they're not the only voices. Dorothy is on the council too, and so are several other members you met last night. George has been invited to this meeting as a special guest to present his proposal. If you're willing, I'd like you to attend as well." "Why?" Daniel's voice came out sharper than he intended. "So they can interrogate me? Judge whether I'm worthy? So they can meet you as a person, not an abstract concept. So they can hear your story, if you're willing to share it. So George's proposal isn't about helping some anonymous homeless kid, but about supporting Daniel Rivera, a young man with talent and potential who's working to rebuild his life." Daniel was silent, fighting the urge to run. Finally, he said, "When is this meeting?" "Sunday evening, after the second service. That gives you 4 days to think about it. 4 days to settle in. Start the job. Prove to yourself that you can do this. Then, if you want to attend the meeting, the door's open. If you don't, that's okay too. The job offer stands either way." Daniel spent the rest of the day thinking about Pastor Jennings's words. He started work immediately, grateful for the physical labor that kept his mind occupied. He mowed the lawns, weeded the gardens, and repaired a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm. The work felt good, purposeful, tangible, something he could see results from. That evening, as he ate dinner alone in his apartment, Dorothy had left another covered dish. There was a knock on his door. He opened it to find George standing there, guitar case in hand. "Mind if I come in?" George asked. "Of course." Daniel stepped aside, nervous about why George was here. George set his guitar case down and settled into one of the chairs. "Pastor Bill told me about the council meeting. I want to apologize. I didn't mean to put you in an uncomfortable position." "It's not your fault," Daniel said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I should have talked to you first before bringing up the music outreach idea. I got excited about the possibility and moved too fast. It's a habit of mine." George's expression was rueful. "My wife Norma used to tell me I had 2 speeds, stopped and full throttle." Daniel sat down across from him. "Can I ask you something?" "Why me?" "I mean, you could recruit trained musicians, people with credentials and experience. Why risk your reputation on someone like me?" George was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Because credentials and experience aren't what this program needs most. It needs authenticity. It needs someone who understands what it's like to be broken, to feel worthless, to wonder if there's any point in going on. Someone who can look into the eyes of people in shelters or nursing homes and say, "I've been there," and mean it. He leaned forward, his expression intense. "Daniel, I've worked with hundreds of musicians over my career. Some of them were technically perfect, but emotionally hollow. Others had all the heart in the world, but lacked skill. You have both. I heard it in your voice on that street corner. I saw it in your face during the service. You're the real thing." "I'm a mess," Daniel said quietly. "I'm barely holding it together." "Yes, and that's exactly why you're right for this. Because you're still in the process of healing, you'll remember what it feels like to need healing. The moment you forget that, the moment you start thinking you've got it all figured out, that's when you lose the ability to truly help others." Daniel wanted to believe him, but couldn't quite get there. "What if I fail? What if I let you down? Then we'll figure it out together. That's what community means." George picked up his guitar case and opened it. "I brought this for you. I want you to try something." He pulled out a beautiful acoustic guitar, a Martin, Daniel noticed, worth several $1,000s. George held it out to him. "I can't," Daniel said immediately. "That's too expensive. What if I damage it?" "It's a tool, not a museum piece. It's meant to be played." George pushed the guitar gently into Daniel's hands. "Just hold it. You don't have to play. Just hold it." Daniel took the guitar, his hands shaking. The weight of it, the smooth wood, The familiar shape. It all brought memories flooding back. His father teaching him his first chords. Late nights practicing in his dorm room. The last time he'd held a guitar, 2 weeks before his parents died. Video calling them to play a new song he'd learned. "I can't do this," Daniel whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You're doing it right now," George said gently. "You're holding a guitar. You're remembering. That's the first step. It hurts too much. I know, but Daniel, the pain means you loved them. The pain means they mattered. If you're going to carry that pain anyway, wouldn't it be better to carry it while doing something that honors them, rather than while punishing yourself?" Daniel sat there, holding the guitar, crying. George didn't try to comfort him or stop him. He just sat there, present, understanding. Finally, Daniel's fingers, almost of their own accord, found the strings. He strummed once, the chord rough and out of tune. He adjusted the tuning pegs, strummed again. Better. And then, so quietly it was barely audible, he began to play. Not a hymn, not a worship song, but a simple melody his father had taught him when he was 8 years old. A traditional Mexican lullaby his grandmother used to sing. "Arroró mi niño, arroró mi sol, arroró pedazo de mi corazón." His voice cracked, the Spanish lyrics falling from his lips like a prayer. George sat perfectly still, barely breathing, letting Daniel work through whatever he needed to work through. When Daniel finished, he set the guitar carefully aside and looked at George. "How do I do this? How do I move forward when part of me is still buried with them?" "You take it one day at a time," George said. "Some days you'll be able to play. Some days you won't. Some days you'll feel like you're making progress. Other days you'll feel like you're back at square one. That's normal. That's how grief works. Will it ever stop hurting?" "No," George said honestly. "But the hurt will change. It'll become something you can carry rather than something that carries you. And eventually, you'll find that you can hold both things at once. The pain of loss and the joy of living. They don't cancel each other out. They coexist." Daniel nodded slowly, not entirely convinced, but willing to try to believe. "So," George said, his tone becoming more practical, "about this council meeting. You don't have to attend, but if you do, I want you to know what to expect. Richard Montgomery is going to question whether this is a wise use of church resources. Patricia Hayes is going to question whether you're a reliable representative of the church. They're going to be skeptical, maybe even hostile. Framarit sidra alert foni tind." "That's not exactly encouraging," Daniel said dryly. "I'm not trying to encourage you. I'm trying to prepare you. Because if you decide to do this, if you decide to be part of this outreach program, you need to know that not everyone is going to be supportive. Some people are going to see you as a charity case. Others are going to see you as a risk. A few are going to see you as an opportunity for the church to actually live out its values, instead of just talking about them. Which group do you think outnumbers the others? I honestly don't know. That's why I want you there. So you can tell your story in your own words, so they can see you as a person, not a problem to be solved or avoided." Daniel thought about this. What if I don't want to share my story with a room full of strangers? Then don't. You don't owe anyone your pain or your history. But I will tell you this. When people see vulnerability, when they see someone being genuinely honest about their struggles, it's harder for them to dismiss that person. It's easier to say no to an abstract concept than to a real human being sitting in front of you. "That feels manipulative," Daniel said. "It would be, if it wasn't true. I'm not asking you to perform sadness or exaggerate your situation. I'm asking you to be honest. If honesty happens to make people more compassionate, that's not manipulation. That's just human nature. After George left, leaving the guitar behind over Daniel's protests, Daniel sat alone with his thoughts. He picked up the guitar again, running his fingers over the strings without playing. Could he really do this? Could he stand in front of a group of skeptical church members and advocate for himself? He thought about his mother, who'd stood up to school administrators when they wanted to cut the music program, his father, who'd spent hours writing grant proposals to save his job when budget cuts threatened the music teacher position. They'd both been fighters in their own quiet ways. They'd taught him that things worth having were worth fighting for. Maybe it was time to fight for something again. Maybe it was time to stop just surviving and start actually living. Sunday evening came faster than Daniel expected. He'd worked hard all week, proving to himself and to Pastor Jennings that he could handle the responsibilities. Dorothy had continued to bring him meals and introduce him to more church members. Harold Peterson, the retired firefighter, had spent an afternoon teaching him how to use the sound system. Jessica Warner, the Sunday school teacher, had asked him to help supervise a youth group event. And he'd discovered he actually enjoyed working with the teenagers. The church council met in a conference room off the main hallway. Daniel arrived 10 minutes early, his stomach churning with anxiety. He'd dressed in the best clothes he had, the thrift store shirt and pants, carefully washed and ironed. Dorothy was already there, arranging folders and papers. She saw him and smiled. "You clean up nice. How are you feeling?" "Terrified," he admitted. "Good. That means you care about the outcome. Just be yourself. That's all anyone can ask." The council members began arriving. Pastor Jennings introduced Daniel to each of them. Most were friendly, if slightly reserved. Thomas and Rebecca Flynn, the young couple with the baby, greeted him warmly. Harold Peterson clapped him on the shoulder. Others offered polite handshakes and cautious smiles. Then Richard Montgomery arrived. He was in his early 60s, tall and imposing, with silver hair styled carefully, and an expensive suit that probably cost more than Daniel had spent on clothes in his entire life. His handshake was firm to the point of being aggressive, and his eyes assessed Daniel with the cold calculation of someone used to evaluating property values and business deals. "So, you're the young man George has taken an interest in," Richard said, his tone neutral but somehow conveying skepticism. "Yes, sir." "Daniel Rivera." "Where are you from originally, Daniel?" "Houston, sir." "And you've been in San Antonio for 6 months. Doing what, before you started working here?" The question felt like a trap, but Daniel decided honesty was his only option. "Surviving, mostly. I was homeless after my parents died." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. And now you're living in church property and working here. That's quite a turnaround in a short time." "I'm grateful for the opportunity," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady. "Gratitude is easy. Follow-through is what matters." Richard moved past him to take a seat at the head of the conference table. Patricia Hayes arrived moments later. She was in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in a conservative pantsuit, her gray hair cut in a severe bob. She had the bearing of someone used to authority, and the suspicious eyes of someone who'd seen too many students try to deceive her over the years. "You must be Daniel," she said, offering a brief handshake. "Pastor Jennings has told me about you. I understand you have musical training?" "Yes, ma'am. I studied at Berklee College of Music for 1 semester before you dropped out," she finished. "Why did you drop out?" "My parents died. I couldn't focus on school." "I see. And in the 6 months since then, you've been homeless rather than working or returning to school. That suggests a certain lack of initiative." Daniel felt his face flush with anger, but forced himself to remain calm. "With respect, ma'am, grief doesn't run on a schedule. I did what I needed to do to survive. Survival and success are two different things, young man. George arrived just then, saving Daniel from having to respond. He greeted everyone warmly, then took a seat next to Daniel. A subtle show of support that Richard Montgomery definitely noticed. Pastor Jennings called the meeting to order. They went through routine business first. Budget reports, upcoming events, facility maintenance issues. Daniel listened, trying to understand the church's inner workings and the relationships between council members. Finally, Pastor Jennings said, "The last item on our agenda is a proposal from George Strait regarding a new music outreach program. George, would you like to present?" George stood, and Daniel was struck by how comfortable he seemed, how naturally he commanded the room despite not being officially part of the church leadership. "Thank you, Pastor Bill. I'll keep this brief because I know everyone's time is valuable." He pulled out a simple one-page proposal and handed copies to each council member. "For the past few years, I've been thinking about how music can serve as a bridge to people who might not otherwise engage with faith communities. People in nursing homes who are isolated, residents of homeless shelters who feel forgotten, veterans struggling with trauma, teenagers in juvenile detention facilities. These are all populations that traditional church outreach often misses." He let that sink in for a moment. "I'm proposing a program where trained musicians, starting small, maybe just 1 or 2 people, would visit these locations on a regular basis. Not to proselytize, not to preach, but simply to share music, to create community, to remind people that they matter. If conversations about faith arise naturally, great. If not, we're still fulfilling Christ's command to visit the sick, feed the hungry, and care for the imprisoned." "How would this be funded?" Richard asked immediately. "I'm prepared to fund the initial pilot program myself," George said. "Equipment, transportation, any necessary insurance. The only thing I'm asking from the church is endorsement and administrative support, help with scheduling, volunteer coordination, that kind of thing. If the program proves successful after 6 months, we can discuss whether the church wants to incorporate it into the regular budget." "And who would lead this program?" Patricia asked, though her eyes had already moved to Daniel. "I'd like Daniel Rivera to be the primary musician once he's ready. With my mentorship and oversight initially, then gradually more independently as he gains confidence and experience." The room erupted in overlapping conversations. Richard Montgomery raised his hand for silence. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Richard said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "You want this church to endorse a program led by someone who has been, by his own admission, homeless for the past 6 months. Someone with no professional experience, no references, and 1 semester of college education. And you want our church's name attached to this?" "Richard, that's a bit harsh," Dorothy started, but Richard cut her off. "I'm being realistic, Dorothy. We have a responsibility to this congregation and to the community. Our reputation matters. What happens when people find out that the person representing our outreach program was living on the streets just weeks ago? What happens when he relapses, when he disappears, when this whole thing falls apart?" Daniel felt his face burning with shame and anger. He started to stand, ready to leave, but George's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "Richard, you're right that reputation matters," George said calmly. "But whose reputation are we protecting? The church's or Christ's? Because if I remember correctly, Jesus spent most of his time with people society had written off. Tax collectors, prostitutes, lepers, people who had failed, who had struggled, who didn't have impressive credentials." "That's a convenient interpretation," Patricia interjected. "But Jesus also expected transformation. He told the woman caught in adultery to go and sin no more. He didn't just accept people as they were. He called them to be better. Exactly, George said. He called them to be better. He didn't wait until they were perfect to use them. He worked with them in their imperfection. Peter denied him 3 times, yet Jesus built his church on Peter. Paul persecuted Christians before becoming the greatest missionary. God has a habit of using broken people for his purposes. That's all very inspirational, Richard said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. But we're not talking about biblical history. We're talking about real resources, real liability, real consequences if this goes wrong. Then let me address those concerns specifically, George said, pulling out another document. I've consulted with the church's insurance company. Daniel would be covered under the existing volunteer liability policy as long as he completes a background check and a basic training program. I've already arranged for both. The background check came back clean. No criminal record, no red flags. He looked directly at Richard. As for references, Pastor Bill has observed Daniel's work this week. So have Dorothy, Harold, and Jessica. They can speak to his character and reliability. And as for experience, everyone has to start somewhere. I had no professional experience when I sang my first song in public. I just had a gift, and people willing to take a chance on me. Harold Peterson spoke up for the first time. I've worked with Daniel this week, teaching him the sound system. The kid's a quick learner, polite, hardworking, showed up early every day and stayed late. That says something about character. I agree, Jessica Warner added. He helped with our youth group event on Friday. The teenagers responded to him really well. He was patient, authentic, and actually engaged with them instead of talking down to them. We could use more volunteers like that. Dorothy nodded. I've spent time with Daniel every day since he arrived. I've seen how he carries himself, how he treats people, how he's working to rebuild his life. This young man has more integrity in his little finger than some people I know who've never faced a day of hardship. The pointed look she gave Richard wasn't subtle. With all due respect to everyone's observations, Patricia said, her tone making it clear she had little respect for their opinions. A week is hardly enough time to judge someone's character. People can put on a good show for a week. What happens in a month, 6 months, a year? What happens when the pressure builds and old patterns resurface? Those are fair questions, Pastor Jennings said. But they're questions we could ask about anyone, aren't they? Rebecca and Thomas joined this church 6 months ago. Should we not allow them to serve because we haven't known them long enough? Jessica moved here from Dallas 2 years ago. Should we have made her wait longer before teaching Sunday school? That's different, Patricia said quickly. How? The pastor asked genuinely. Because they weren't homeless? Because they came from more conventional backgrounds? I'm not being confrontational, Patricia. I'm genuinely asking what makes Daniel's situation different besides the nature of his hardship. Patricia struggled to articulate an answer that wouldn't sound prejudiced. Finally, she said, it's about stability, about knowing someone won't just disappear when things get difficult. Then let's talk about commitment, George said. He turned to Daniel. Daniel, I know this is uncomfortable, but would you be willing to share your story with the council? Help them understand who you are and why you're here? Daniel's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to walk out, to protect himself from further judgment. But then he thought about his parents, about how they'd always taught him to stand up for what he believed in, to fight for his dreams, even when it was hard. He stood, his legs shaking slightly. My name is Daniel Rivera. I'm 19 years old. 6 months ago, my parents were killed by a drunk driver on I-10 in Houston. They were driving home from a parent-teacher conference where my dad worked. I was in Boston at the time at Berklee College of Music, studying vocal performance. His voice was steady. though it cost him everything to keep it that way. After they died, I dropped out, used the insurance money to pay for their funeral and the debts they'd left behind. I couldn't stay in Houston. Too many memories. So I came here because my dad grew up in San Antonio. And I thought, I don't know what I thought. Maybe that being in the place he'd called home would make me feel less alone. He looked directly at Richard. You asked what I did for 6 months instead of working or going back to school. I survived. I grieved. I slept in parks and under bridges. I ate in soup kitchens. I stood on street corners and preached scripture because it was the only thing that made me feel like I had any purpose left. And yes, I hit rock bottom. Yes, I gave up on my dreams. Yes, I convinced myself I didn't deserve to have a future. Now he turned to Patricia. You're worried about stability, about whether I'll disappear when things get hard. That's fair, but things have already been as hard as they can get. I've already lost everything that mattered. And I didn't disappear. I didn't give up completely. Something in me kept fighting, kept surviving, kept hoping that maybe there was a reason to keep going. His voice grew stronger. George found me preaching on a street corner. He didn't see a charity case or a risk to manage. He saw a person, someone with potential, someone worth investing in. Pastor Jennings offered me honest work, not a handout. Dorothy and Harold and Jessica treated me with dignity, not pity. And that's what brought me back. Not someone feeling sorry for me, but people believing I could be more than my worst moment. He paused, gathering his courage. You want to know if I'm reliable? If I'll follow through? I can't prove that with words. I can only prove it with actions, over time. But I can tell you this. I have absolutely nothing to lose and everything to gain. This opportunity means more to me than you can possibly understand. It's not just a job or a program. It's a chance to honor my parents' memory by using the gift they sacrificed to develop. It's a chance to help other people who are struggling because I know what that struggle feels like. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each council member. I know I'm not the safest choice. I know I'm not the most conventional candidate. But maybe that's exactly why I'm the right choice. Because the people this program is meant to reach, they're not conventional either. They're broken, lost, struggling, just like I was. And maybe they need to see someone who's been where they are, who understands that healing isn't linear, that rebuilding takes time, that faith isn't about being perfect. It's about getting back up every time you fall. The room was completely silent when Daniel finished. He sat down, his hands shaking, feeling simultaneously exposed and empowered. Richard Montgomery was the first to speak. That was very eloquent. He didn't sound convinced, just surprised. But passion isn't the same as qualifications. What musical experience do you actually have? Before Daniel could answer, George interjected. He has perfect pitch, trained vocal technique, and an innate understanding of how to connect emotionally with an audience. I heard it the first time I listened to him. In 40 years in this business, I've worked with hundreds of singers. Daniel has something special. That's your professional opinion, Richard said. But we can't make decisions based on one person's judgment, even yours. Then let him audition, Dorothy suggested suddenly. Let the council hear him sing. Judge for yourselves whether he has the gift George says he has. Daniel's stomach dropped. I'm not prepared to... You don't need to be prepared, George said quietly. Just sing what you sang for your parents. Sing from your heart. Patricia crossed her arms. I think that's a fair request. If this young man is going to represent our church musically, we should hear what he's capable of. Daniel looked at Pastor Jennings, who gave him an encouraging nod. There was no way out of this that didn't look like he was backing down or hiding something. "Okay," Daniel said quietly, "but I need a guitar." "I've got mine in the truck," George said. "Give me 2 minutes." While George retrieved the guitar, the silence in the room was oppressive. Daniel could feel the council members' eyes on him, assessing, judging. Rebecca Flynn gave him a supportive smile. Harold winked at him. But Richard and Patricia's expressions remained skeptical. George returned with the Martin and handed it to Daniel. "Whatever feels right to you." Daniel took the guitar, his hands trembling. He hadn't performed for anyone but himself since before his parents died. The last time he'd sung for an audience was at a small cafe in Boston, 3 days before he got the phone call that changed everything. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let his fingers find the familiar chords. The song that came to him wasn't a hymn or a contemporary worship song. It was "Tears in Heaven" by Eric Clapton, a song about losing a child, about grief and hope, and the question of whether love continues beyond death. His voice started soft, almost fragile. "Would you know my name if I saw you in heaven? Would it be the same if I saw you in heaven?" As he sang, something shifted. The defensive walls he'd built around his heart began to crumble. The guitar wasn't an instrument of punishment anymore. It was a conduit for everything he'd been holding inside. The grief, the love, the desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, his parents knew he was trying to find his way back. "I must be strong and carry on, 'cause I know I don't belong here in heaven." His voice broke on the last word, but he pushed through, letting the emotion color the notes rather than trying to hide it. When he finished, tears streamed down his face, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. The silence in the room was different now. Not judgmental, but reverent. Dorothy wiped tears from her eyes openly. Rebecca Flynn was crying into her husband's shoulder. Even Harold Peterson, the tough retired firefighter, had moisture in his eyes. Richard Montgomery sat very still, his expression unreadable. Patricia Hayes had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. George squeezed Daniel's shoulder gently. "Thank you for sharing that with us." Daniel set the guitar down carefully, unable to look at anyone. He felt stripped bare, vulnerable in a way that terrified him. Pastor Jennings cleared his throat, his own voice thick with emotion. "I think we've heard enough to make an informed decision. Daniel, would you mind stepping outside for a few minutes while the council discusses?" Daniel nodded mutely and walked out, his legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. He made it to the hallway before collapsing onto a bench, his head in his hands. Inside the conference room, the debate began immediately. "That was extraordinary," Dorothy said firmly. "If anyone in this room can honestly say that young man doesn't have a gift, I'll eat my hat." "Musical talent isn't the issue," Richard said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "The issue is still reliability, experience, and whether we're setting him up for failure by giving him too much responsibility too soon. What responsibility are we actually giving him?" Thomas Flynn spoke up for the first time. "George is funding the program. George is providing oversight. George is taking the risk. We're literally just saying yes or no to letting it happen under our church's name. What's the actual downside? The downside is, if Daniel relapses, disappears, or fails in some public way, our church's name is attached to that failure," Patricia said. But her voice lacked conviction now. "However, I will admit that young man has genuine talent and courage. It takes courage to be that vulnerable in front of strangers. It takes courage because he's been judged harshly by people who don't know his story," Dorothy said pointedly. "People who see his circumstances and make assumptions about his character." "That's not fair, Dorothy," Richard protested. "We have a fiduciary responsibility to this church, and we have a spiritual responsibility to live out our values." Pastor Jennings said quietly. Every Sunday we talk about grace, redemption, second chances. We sing about God's love for the broken and the lost. And now we have an opportunity to actually demonstrate those values, not just talk about them. Are we going to take it? Harold leaned forward. I spent 30 years as a firefighter. You know what I learned? The people who've been through fire themselves are often the best at helping others through it. They don't panic. They understand the fear. They know what's coming. Daniel's been through fire. That doesn't disqualify him. It makes him exactly who we need. I agree, Jessica said. The teenagers I work with, they can smell fake from a mile away. They need authenticity. Daniel has that. He's not trying to pretend he's got it all figured out. That's powerful. Richard sighed heavily. George, if we agree to this, and I'm not saying we should, but if we do, what safeguards are in place? How do we protect Daniel and protect the church? Regular check-ins with Pastor Bill and me, George said. Clear expectations and boundaries. A probationary period where we evaluate how things are going. If at any point Daniel or the church feels it's not working, we can pause or end the program. No hard feelings. I'm not trying to force anything. I'm just asking for a chance. And if Daniel struggles? If he has setbacks? Patricia asked. Then we support him through it, just like we would any church member, Pastor Jennings said. We don't abandon people when they struggle. That's the opposite of what we're called to do. The debate continued for another 20 minutes. Finally, Pastor Jennings called for a vote. All in favor of approving George's music outreach program with Daniel Rivera as the primary participant, raise your hand. Dorothy's hand shot up immediately, followed by Harold's, Jessica's, Thomas, and Rebecca's. After a long pause, 2 more hands went up. Then another. George watched Richard and Patricia. Richard sat with his arms crossed, clearly conflicted. Patricia stared at the table. Finally, Richard raised his hand. Against my better judgment. But yes, on a 6-month probationary basis, with regular evaluations. All eyes turned to Patricia. She looked up, saw everyone watching her, and sighed. I want it on record that I have concerns, serious concerns, but that young man's voice is a gift. And I suppose, if we say we believe in redemption, we need to act like it. She raised her hand. It was unanimous. Pastor Jennings smiled. Then it's settled. George, you can move forward with the program. I'll work with you on the administrative details. George went to get Daniel, who was still sitting on the bench in the hallway, looking like he might bolt at any moment. Come on back in, George said gently. They want to talk to you. Daniel's face was pale. They said no, didn't they? It's okay. I understand. Just come inside. Daniel walked back into the conference room on shaky legs, preparing himself for rejection. Instead, he found most of the council members smiling at him. Pastor Jennings stood. Daniel, the church council has voted to approve the music outreach program. We'd be honored to have you lead it, under George's mentorship. Daniel stared at them, unable to process the words. You're saying yes? We're saying yes, Dorothy confirmed, beaming. Welcome to the team. But I don't understand. Why would you? Because you're exactly what this program needs, Harold said gruffly. Now stop questioning it and say thank you. Thank you, Daniel whispered, tears streaming down his face again. Thank you so much. Richard stood and approached Daniel, extending his hand. I'm going to be watching closely, young man, but I'll admit, your performance was impressive. Don't make me regret this vote. I won't, sir. I promise. Patricia was next. I expect professionalism and commitment. Can you deliver that? Yes, ma'am, I will. She nodded curtly, but there was something softer in her eyes than before. Then I suppose we'll see. After the meeting ended and people began to leave, George pulled Daniel aside. "You did good in there. Really good." "I almost ran away," Daniel admitted. "But you didn't. That's what matters." George smiled. "We start training next week. I want you to work with me 3 times a week. Vocal exercises, song selection, learning how to engage with different audiences. This is going to be work, Daniel. Real work. Are you ready for that?" "I think so. I hope so." "That's honest. And honest is good." George paused. "Your parents would be proud of you. I know you probably don't believe that right now, but they would be." Daniel couldn't respond, his throat too tight with emotion. That night, alone in his apartment, Daniel picked up his mother's Bible and found another letter tucked inside. One from his father, written years ago but never sent, just saved as a keepsake. "Daniel, you have something special. Not just talent, though God knows you have that in abundance. You have heart. You feel things deeply, and that will hurt sometimes. But it's also what will make you great. Don't be afraid of your emotions. Don't hide from pain. Let it shape you, teach you, make you more compassionate. The world needs people who aren't afraid to feel. Te amo siempre." Papa Daniel read the words 3 times, crying quietly. Then he picked up the Martin guitar George had left with him and began to play. Not perfectly, not professionally, just honestly. And for the first time in 6 months, music didn't feel like punishment. It felt like coming home. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Morningside Nursing Home, casting long shadows across the linoleum floors. Daniel stood in the hallway, guitar case in hand, his stomach churning with anxiety. George stood beside him, calm and reassuring. "Remember what we practiced," George said quietly. "Don't overthink it. These folks just want to feel seen, heard, remembered. The music is just the vehicle for connection." It had been 3 weeks since the council meeting. 3 weeks of intensive preparation, vocal training with George, meetings with Pastor Jennings about ministry approach, paperwork and background checks, and planning sessions about which facilities to visit first. Dorothy had insisted on buying Daniel proper performance clothes. Nice jeans, button-down shirts, a decent pair of boots. He'd protested the expense, but she'd waved him off. "You're representing our church now. You need to look the part." Morningside was their first official outreach visit. The activities director, Linda Morrison, a cheerful woman in her 50s with bright red hair, greeted them warmly. "We're so excited to have you here," she said, leading them toward the common room. "Our residents don't get many visitors, especially ones bringing live music. Most of them are in their 80s and 90s. Some have dementia or Alzheimer's. Some are pretty sharp. Just be patient and don't take it personally if someone falls asleep or seems uninterested." The common room was spacious but institutional. Plain walls, fluorescent lighting, rows of chairs and wheelchairs arranged in a semicircle. About 30 residents filled the space, some alert and expectant, others staring blankly into space. Daniel's anxiety spiked. This was real. These were real people depending on him to bring something meaningful into their day. George set up 2 chairs and adjusted his guitar. Daniel did the same, his hands trembling slightly as he tuned the strings. "Good morning, everyone," George said warmly, his voice carrying easily across the room. "My name is George Strait, and this is my friend Daniel Rivera. We're from First Baptist Church, and we're here to share some music with you this morning. We've got country, gospel, and some old standards. If you know the words, please sing along. If you just want to listen, that's fine too." He started with "Amazing Grace," his voice filling the room with warmth and familiarity. Some residents immediately began singing along, their voices wavering but earnest. Others closed their eyes, swaying gently. One woman in the front row had tears streaming down her face. Daniel watched, absorbing how George engaged with the audience, making eye contact, smiling at individuals, acknowledging people who sang along. This wasn't performance. It was ministry. It was connection. After 3 songs, George nodded to Daniel. "My friend Daniel is going to sing a few for you now." Daniel's mouth went dry. He'd practiced for hours, but suddenly every song he'd prepared seemed wrong, inadequate. Then he saw an elderly man in a wheelchair, his face slack, his eyes distant. The man wore a faded Army veteran cap. Without planning to, Daniel began playing "God Bless the USA" by Lee Greenwood. His voice started soft but grew stronger as he sang about pride, sacrifice, and love of country. The effect was immediate. The veteran's eyes focused. His hand, which had been hanging limp, rose slowly to his heart. Other residents sat straighter. Some began to sing along, their voices cracking with emotion. When Daniel finished, the applause was enthusiastic. The veteran was crying openly, and a nurse went to comfort him. "That was beautiful, young man," called out an elderly woman with snow-white hair and bright blue eyes. "Do you know any Patsy Cline?" Daniel smiled. "I know Crazy. Would you like to hear that?" "Oh, I'd love it. That was my song when I was young and foolish." She laughed, and others joined in. Daniel sang Crazy, pouring emotion into every word. As he sang, he noticed George watching him with approval, saw residents connecting not just with the song, but with the feeling behind it. They spent 90 minutes at Morningside, alternating songs, taking requests, and between musical sets, talking with residents. George told stories from his career, funny anecdotes that made people laugh, touching moments that made them cry. Daniel shared less, but listened intently, learning how to read the room, how to adjust the energy, how to make people feel valued. An elderly woman named Margaret Phillips pulled Daniel aside afterward. She was tiny, perhaps 90 pounds, with papery skin and hands gnarled with arthritis. But her eyes were sharp and knowing. "You've got sadness in you," she said directly. "I can hear it in your voice. Beautiful sadness." Daniel didn't know how to respond. Yes, ma'am. I lost my parents recently. I lost my husband 62 years ago," Margaret said. "He died in Korea. We'd only been married 8 months. I thought my life was over. Thought I'd never smile again. Never feel joy again." She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "But you know what? Grief becomes part of you. Not all of you. You learn to carry it. And the gift you have, that voice, it's bigger than your pain. Don't waste it feeling sorry for yourself." The words should have stung, but delivered in her matter-of-fact way. They felt like wisdom. "How did you move forward?" Daniel asked. "I didn't move on. I moved through. I let myself feel everything. The anger, the unfairness, the loneliness. But I also let myself live. I became a teacher, raised my sister's kids when she died, traveled to 43 countries, learned to paint at 70. Your husband, your parents, whoever you've lost, they don't want you to stop living. They want you to live enough for both of you." As they left Morningside, Daniel was quiet, processing everything. "That went well," George observed. "You connected with them. Did you feel it?" "Yeah," Daniel admitted. "I didn't expect to, but yeah, especially when I saw that veteran respond. It felt like the music actually mattered, like it did something." "That's what this is about," George said. "Not performance, not showing off technique. Connection, ministry, using your gift to remind people they're not forgotten." Over the next 6 weeks, they established a routine. Tuesdays at Morningside, Thursdays at Haven House, a homeless shelter on the east side, Friday afternoons at the VA hospital. Each location brought different challenges and rewards. At Haven House, Daniel met people who reminded him painfully of his own recent past. Men and women who'd lost everything, who struggled with addiction, mental illness, or just bad luck. The first time he performed there, he was so nervous he almost couldn't sing. But then he saw a young woman, maybe 25, sitting alone in the back row. And something in her defeated posture broke his heart. He sang Amazing Grace. But as he did, he spoke between verses, sharing his own story. 6 months ago, I was sleeping under a bridge. I was convinced my life was over, that I didn't deserve anything good. I stood on street corners preaching scripture because I'd forgotten how to dream about anything better. The room went silent. People who'd been half asleep sat up. The young woman in the back row was crying. "I'm not going to tell you it's easy to get out of where you are," Daniel continued. "I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers, because I don't. I still struggle. I still have days where I wake up and wonder if this is real or if I'm going to wake up back on the streets. But I'm learning that rock bottom can be a foundation if you let it be. That the lowest point in your life doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning." After the session, the young woman approached him. Her name was Ashley Bennett, and her story was heartbreaking. Abusive relationship, lost custody of her daughter, spiraled into drug use. Been clean for 3 months, but terrified she'd relapse. "How do you keep going?" she asked him. "How do you wake up every day and choose hope when everything feels hopeless?" Daniel thought about Margaret Phillips's words, about his parents' letters, about the guitar that had felt like punishment and now felt like purpose. "I don't always choose hope," he admitted honestly. "Some days, I just choose to survive that day. Some days, I just choose to do the next right thing, even if I can't see past that. And slowly, those days add up. The steps get a little easier. The hope gets a little more real." Ashley nodded, wiping her eyes. "Thank you for being honest. Everyone else just gives me platitudes." "Platitudes don't help when you're drowning," Daniel said. "Sometimes you just need someone to say, 'I know it's hard,' and mean it." He gave her Pastor Jennings's card. "This church has resources, counseling, support groups, job placement help. No judgment, no conditions, just help, if you want it." George observed these interactions with growing confidence in Daniel. The young man wasn't just performing music. He was becoming a minister in the truest sense. He was meeting people in their pain, not above it. At the VA hospital, Daniel connected especially with veterans dealing with PTSD and traumatic injuries. His father's best friend had been a Marine, and Daniel had grown up hearing stories about military service, sacrifice, and the struggles veterans faced coming home. One Friday, he met Christopher Wells, a 32-year-old Army sergeant who'd lost both legs in Afghanistan. Christopher was angry, bitter, convinced his life was over at 32. "Don't sing me any patriotic bullshit," Christopher said bluntly when Daniel approached. "I'm not in the mood for God Bless America or Star-Spangled Banner." "Fair enough," Daniel said, not offended. "What would you like to hear?" "Something real. Something that doesn't pretend everything's okay when it's not." Daniel thought for a moment, then began playing Hurt by Johnny Cash, a song about regret, pain, and wondering if redemption is even possible. His voice was raw, unpolished, real. "What have I become, my sweetest friend? Everyone I know goes away in the end." Christopher listened, his jaw tight, his eyes glistening. When Daniel finished, he said quietly, "Play it again." Daniel did. This time, Christopher sang along on the chorus. his voice broken but powerful. Afterward, they talked for an hour. Not about music, but about loss. About feeling like you'd failed people who depended on you. About wondering if life had any purpose left. "I used to be a soldier," Christopher said. "That was my identity. Now I'm just broken." "You're not just anything," Daniel said firmly. "You're still a soldier. Your legs don't define your service or your value. Your sacrifice matters. Your experience matters. And yeah, your life looks different now than you planned. Trust me, I understand that. But different doesn't mean worthless." "What do you know about it?" Christopher challenged. "You've got both your legs." "You're right. I don't know what you're going through specifically, but I know what it's like to have your entire life plan destroyed in a moment. I know what it's like to feel like you're not the person you were supposed to be. And I know what it's like to have someone see past that and believe you can still be something." Christopher was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "Come back next week?" "I'll be here," Daniel promised. As the program grew, so did Daniel's confidence and skill. He started writing his own songs, simple, honest pieces about loss, hope, and the struggle to keep going. George encouraged him, offering feedback, but never trying to change Daniel's authentic voice. One evening, working late in the church office on scheduling for the outreach program, Daniel found Pastor Jennings still there, reviewing his sermon for Sunday. "You're doing remarkable work," the pastor said, inviting Daniel to sit. "George tells me you've been exceeding expectations." "I'm just trying to show up and be honest," Daniel said. "That's exactly what people need. Honesty, authenticity, someone who's willing to be vulnerable." Pastor Jennings set down his pen. "I wanted to ask you something. Have you thought about what comes next? After the 6-month probation period?" "Not really," Daniel admitted. "I've been focused on just getting through each week." "That's understandable. But I think you should start thinking bigger. This program is working because of you, Daniel. Your connection with people, your willingness to share your own struggles. Have you considered whether this might be a calling, not just a job?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not qualified to be in ministry. I barely go to Sunday services. I still have doubts about God, about faith, about whether any of this matters." "Good," Pastor Jennings said, surprising him. "The best ministers are the ones who wrestle with doubt, the ones who ask hard questions, the ones who don't pretend to have all the answers. You're doing more ministry right now than many ordained pastors I know. I don't know if I believe that. You don't have to. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep showing up. Keep being real with people. The rest will figure itself out." As Daniel walked back to his apartment that night, he thought about the pastor's words. Was this really a calling? Could someone like him, broken, doubting, still healing, actually be used for something meaningful? He thought about Margaret Phillips, about Ashley Bennett, about Christopher Wells, people who'd been touched not by his perfection, but by his willingness to share his imperfection. Maybe that was the whole point. Maybe God didn't use perfect people because perfect people couldn't connect with broken ones. Maybe the cracks in his foundation weren't disqualifications. They were exactly what made him useful. That night, he wrote a new song. Not about having arrived, but about the journey. About being broken and building anyway. About hope not as certainty, but as choice. When he finished, he sent a recording to George. The response came back within minutes. "This is the one. This is your voice. Keep going." Daniel read the message 3 times, then looked at his parents' photo on his nightstand. The one possession he'd managed to keep through everything. "I'm trying," he whispered to their smiling faces. "I'm really trying." And for the first time, he felt like maybe trying was enough. November brought cooler weather to San Antonio, the oppressive heat finally giving way to comfortable temperatures. Daniel had been working with the music outreach program for 3 months, and the 6-month evaluation was approaching rapidly. He felt the pressure mounting, the need to prove himself, to justify the church's faith in him, to show Richard Montgomery and Patricia Hayes that their reluctant votes hadn't been mistakes. The program had expanded beyond the initial 3 locations. They now visited 2 additional nursing homes, a juvenile detention center, and a women's recovery center. Daniel had developed a reputation in these places. The young man with the honest voice who didn't preach at people, but connected with them. But success brought new challenges. One Thursday evening, Daniel arrived at Haven House for their regular session, and immediately sensed something was wrong. The usual friendly atmosphere felt tense. Ashley Bennett, who'd been attending regularly and had made significant progress in her recovery, was nowhere to be seen. Linda Chen, the shelter director, pulled Daniel aside. Ashley relapsed 2 days ago. She left the shelter, and we haven't heard from her since. I thought you should know. Daniel felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Ashley had been doing so well. She'd reconnected with her sister, started job training, talked about the possibility of regaining custody of her daughter. They'd spent hours talking about hope, about second chances, about not giving up. "Do you know where she might be?" Daniel asked. "No idea. She has friends from her using days, but I don't have contacts for them. I'm worried, Daniel." She was fragile, and relapse can be deadly. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Ashley, about how he'd told her things get better, about how he'd given her hope. Had he been irresponsible? Had he promised something he couldn't deliver? The next morning, instead of going to his regular church duties, Daniel went back to his old street corner on Commerce Street. He didn't know why exactly. Some instinct told him that if Ashley had relapsed, she might end up in the areas where homeless people congregated. He spent the morning asking people if they'd seen her, showing them a photo she'd given him. Most people shook their heads or ignored him. But an older homeless man named Frank remembered her. "Yeah, I seen her. Couple days ago, down by the Riverwalk, near the abandoned warehouse on Flores Street. She was with some rough people, man. Didn't look good." Daniel's heart raced. He knew he should call the police or tell Linda, but he also knew that Ashley trusted him. If there was any chance he could reach her, he had to try. The abandoned warehouse was in a rough part of town Daniel knew too well from his own months on the streets. Broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, and the unmistakable smell of decay. He approached carefully, hearing voices inside. He found Ashley in a back room with 3 other people, all clearly high. She looked awful, gaunt, hollow-eyed, nothing like the hopeful young woman he'd seen 2 weeks ago. "Ashley," he said gently. She looked up, her eyes struggling to focus. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" "I came to find you." Linda's worried. "I'm worried." One of the men with her stood up aggressively. "Who the hell is this, Ash?" "Nobody. Just a friend." Her voice was slurred. "You need to leave," Daniel said to the others. "I need to talk to Ashley alone." The man laughed. "You're gonna tell us what to do? In our spot?" Daniel held his ground, his heart pounding. "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just want to help my friend." "Your friend doesn't need help. She's fine right where she is." The situation was escalating. Daniel realized he'd made a mistake coming here alone, but he couldn't leave Ashley in this condition. He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling someone to come get her. You can stay, you can go, but she's leaving with me." The man moved toward him threateningly, but Ashley suddenly stood up, stumbling. "Stop! Just stop! Daniel, you shouldn't be here. You don't understand. I can't do it. I tried, but I can't." "Yes, you can," Daniel said firmly. "Ashley, look at me. You can do this. One day at a time, remember? You've been clean for 3 months. That matters. That counts." "It doesn't count if I just throw it away," she screamed, her voice breaking. "Don't you get it? I'm broken. I'm always going to be broken." "So am I," Daniel shouted back. "You think I've got it all figured out? You think I don't wake up every single day terrified that I'm going to fail, that I'm going to end up back on the streets, that I'm fooling everyone, including myself?" The raw emotion in his voice stopped everyone. Even the aggressive man backed off slightly. "I'm as broken as you are," Daniel continued, his voice softer now. "But I'm trying anyway. And some days trying is all we've got. Please, Ashley, let me help you. Let me call Linda. Let's get you somewhere safe." Ashley stood there, swaying, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so tired, Daniel. I'm so tired of trying and failing. I know, but you don't have to do it alone. That's the whole point. Nobody gets through this stuff alone." She looked at the people she'd been using with, then back at Daniel. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, call Linda." Daniel called Linda, then George, who arrived within 20 minutes to help. They got Ashley into George's truck and drove her to a detox facility that Linda had arranged. Through it all, Ashley clung to Daniel's hand like a lifeline. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry I let everyone down." "You didn't let anyone down," Daniel said firmly. "Relapse is part of recovery. It doesn't erase your progress. It's just a setback, not an ending." At the facility, as they were checking Ashley in, George pulled Daniel aside. "That was dangerous, what you did. Going to that place alone. I know, I wasn't thinking clearly, but it was also brave, and it mattered. You reached her when she was at her lowest. That's what this work is about." George paused. "How are you holding up?" Daniel realized he was shaking. "I don't know. I feel like I failed her. Like my words weren't enough." "Your words weren't supposed to fix her, Daniel. Nobody's words can do that. But they reminded her that someone cares, that she's worth saving. That's not nothing." Over the next week, Daniel visited Ashley every day during the facility's visiting hours. She was going through the painful process of detox, angry one moment and despairing the next. But she kept showing up to their conversations, kept fighting. "Why do you keep coming?" she asked one day. "You barely know me." "Because 6 months ago, someone kept showing up for me when they barely knew me," Daniel said. "George could have just walked past me on that street corner. Pastor Jennings could have said the church was full. Dorothy could have decided I wasn't worth the effort. But they didn't. They kept showing up. So that's what I'm doing for you. What if I fail again? Then we figure it out again." Ashley, recovery isn't a straight line. It's messy and complicated, and you're going to have good days and bad days. But as long as you keep trying, as long as you don't give up on yourself, there's hope. The incident with Ashley weighed on Daniel as the 6-month evaluation approached. He felt the pressure to show perfect results, to prove that the program was working without complications. But life wasn't that simple. The evaluation meeting was scheduled for a Friday evening. George encouraged Daniel to prepare a presentation showing what they'd accomplished. Numbers served, locations visited, testimonials from facility directors. Daniel worked on it for days, trying to quantify the unquantifiable. How do you measure impact when the work is about human connection, not statistics? The night before the meeting, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about all the people he'd met. Margaret Phillips, Christopher Wells, Ashley Bennett. People whose lives weren't success stories yet, just ongoing struggles with moments of grace mixed in. At 2 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and went to the church sanctuary. It was dark and empty, the kind of silence that makes you confront whatever you've been avoiding. He sat in a pew and, for the first time in months, tried to pray. Really pray. Not just recite scripture or go through motions. "I don't know if you're listening," he said to the darkness. "I don't even know if I believe in you most days. But if you're there, help me know what to say tomorrow. Help me show them that this work matters, even when it's messy, even when people relapse, even when there aren't perfect outcomes." He sat in the silence, not expecting an answer. But something shifted inside him, a clarity he hadn't felt before. He didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to tell the truth. The evaluation meeting was packed. Not just the church council, but also George, several volunteers who'd helped with the program, and representatives from the facilities they'd visited. Daniel had expected a small meeting. This felt like a tribunal. Richard Montgomery called the meeting to order. "We're here to evaluate the music outreach program's first 6 months and decide whether to continue, expand, or terminate it. George and Daniel, why don't you start by presenting what you've accomplished?" George nodded to Daniel, giving him the floor. Daniel stood, his carefully prepared presentation in hand. But as he looked at the faces around the table, some supportive, some skeptical, all expectant, he set the papers aside. "I was going to give you statistics," he said. "Tell you that we've visited 8 facilities, served approximately 500 individuals, logged over 200 hours of direct engagement. Those numbers are true, and they're in the written report if you want them. But they don't tell you what actually happened these past 6 months." He took a breath. 6 months ago, I was homeless, hopeless, and convinced my life was over. This church took a chance on me. A huge risk, honestly. You gave me work, housing, dignity, and purpose. And then George invited me into this program to share music with people who are struggling just like I was. He looked around the room. "Here's what I learned. This work is messy. It's not about perfect outcomes or inspiring success stories. It's about showing up for people in their worst moments and reminding them they're not alone. Some of the people I've worked with have made incredible progress. Others have struggled. Some have relapsed or disappeared. But every single one of them mattered." He paused, deciding whether to share Ashley's story. "Last week I found one of our regular participants from Haven House in an abandoned warehouse, high and ready to give up. I went there alone, which was stupid and dangerous. But I went because she mattered to me. Because 3 months ago she sat in our session crying, and I told her that hope was possible. And when she relapsed, I didn't want her to think I'd lied or that I'd given up on her." Richard leaned forward. "Did you get her help?" "Yes. She's in a detox facility now, fighting again. Will she make it? I don't know. But she's trying. And that's not nothing." Patricia spoke up. "Daniel, that's admirable. But it's also concerning. You put yourself at risk. What if something had happened to you? The church could be liable." "You're right," Daniel admitted. "I should have called someone first. I made a judgment call that was probably wrong from a policy standpoint. But I'd make the same call again, because that's what this work is about. It's not about protecting ourselves or managing risk. It's about loving people even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable." Dorothy smiled proudly. Harold nodded. "These past 6 months," Daniel continued, "I've sung for elderly people who are forgotten by their families. Veterans who've sacrificed everything and feel like nobody cares. People in shelters whose society has written off. Teenagers in detention who've made mistakes and think they can't be redeemed. And every single time, I've thought about how lucky I am. Because 6 months ago, I was the one written off. I was the one people crossed the street to avoid. And this church said, 'We see you. You matter. You have value.' His voice grew stronger. If we terminate this program because it's messy or risky or doesn't produce perfect outcomes, then we're saying that only easy, safe ministry is worth doing. We're saying that people who struggle too much aren't worth the effort. And I can't believe that's who we are as a church. The room was silent. Daniel sat down, his heart pounding, wondering if he'd just talked himself out of everything he'd built. Linda Morrison, the activities director from Morningside, raised her hand. "May I speak?" Pastor Jennings nodded. "Please. I've worked in senior care for 20 years. I've seen countless volunteer programs come and go. Most of them are well-meaning, but superficial. People come in, sing a few songs, pat themselves on the back for helping, and leave. Daniel is different. He learns residents' names. He sits with them after sessions and listens to their stories. He came back on his own time to visit Margaret Phillips when she was sick, even though it wasn't scheduled. Our residents ask about him constantly. When is that young man with the beautiful voice coming back? That's impact." Christopher Wells's nurse from the VA hospital spoke next. "Sergeant Wells has been with us for 8 months. He's been resistant to all therapy, all programming, all attempts to help him adjust to his injuries. He was hostile, depressed, refusing treatment. Then Daniel started coming. Something about Daniel's honesty, his willingness to admit he doesn't have answers, broke through Chris's walls. Chris is now participating in physical therapy, attending counseling, and talking about his future. Daniel did that. One by one, representatives from facilities shared similar stories. Not stories of perfect transformation, but stories of connection, hope, small steps forward. Finally, Richard Montgomery spoke. "Daniel, I'll be honest. When this program was proposed, I voted yes, reluctantly. I thought it was risky, potentially embarrassing for the church, and likely to fail. I was wrong." Daniel's eyes widened. "You've done something remarkable," Richard continued. "Not perfect, but remarkable. And your honesty today, about the messiness, about Ashley's relapse, about your own struggles, that actually makes me more confident, not less. Because you're not trying to sell us a fantasy. You're showing us real ministry." Patricia nodded. "I agree. I've been skeptical of you from the beginning, Daniel, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I've watched how you've conducted yourself these past months, how you show up consistently, how you've grown, how you've maintained professionalism even while being vulnerable. That takes maturity." She looked at the whole council. "I move that we not only continue the program, but expand it. Double the budget. Allow Daniel to recruit additional volunteers and establish this as a permanent part of our church's ministry." Dorothy seconded immediately. The vote was unanimous. Daniel sat stunned as people congratulated him. George squeezed his shoulder, his eyes suspiciously bright. Pastor Jennings smiled broadly. After the meeting, as people filtered out, Richard approached Daniel. "I owe you an apology. I judged you based on your circumstances, rather than your character. That was wrong. You were protecting your church," Daniel said. "I understand. Maybe. But there's protecting, and there's being closed-minded. You've taught me something about grace, both giving it and receiving it." He extended his hand. "Thank you for proving me wrong." That evening, George and Daniel sat in George's truck in the church parking lot, neither quite ready to go home. "You did it, kid," George said quietly. "You really did it." "We did it," Daniel corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it and made something beautiful on the other side." George was quiet for a moment. "Your parents would be incredibly proud." Daniel felt tears sting his eyes. "I hope so. I really hope so. I know so." George pulled out his phone. "I want to show you something." He played a video that had been taken during one of their sessions at Morningside. Daniel singing Amazing Grace, with residents joining in. The camera panned across faces lit with joy, with connection, with hope. "That's what you've created," George said. "Look at those faces. Look at what your willingness to be broken and honest has given them. That's your parents' legacy living on through you. That's their investment in your education, their belief in your gift, their love. All of it continuing to make a difference in the world." Daniel watched the video, seeing himself through different eyes. Not as the broken kid who'd lost everything, but as someone who'd taken his brokenness and transformed it into something that helped others. "What happens now?" Daniel asked. "Now you keep going. You expand the program, train other volunteers, reach more people, and you keep healing. Both things at the same time." George smiled. "That's the secret, Daniel. You don't heal and then help others. You heal while helping others. The work itself is part of your recovery." 2 weeks later, Daniel stood on the stage at First Baptist Church during the Sunday morning service. Pastor Jennings had asked him to share his testimony and sing a song. Daniel had initially refused. The congregation was over 1,000 people, far more than he'd ever performed for, but Dorothy had convinced him. "People need to hear your story," she'd said. "Not the sanitized version, the real one. It'll give them permission to be real about their own struggles." Now, standing in front of all those people, Daniel's hands shook. But then he saw faces he recognized. Dorothy in the third row, beaming. Harold and Jessica. Thomas and Rebecca with their baby. Christopher Wells, who'd gotten a day pass from the VA hospital specifically to attend. Ashley Bennett, 2 weeks sober, sitting next to Linda from Haven House. And in the back row, George Strait, trying to be inconspicuous, but failing because people kept recognizing him. Daniel stepped to the microphone. 6 months ago, I stood on a street corner a few blocks from here, preaching scripture to people who mostly ignored me. I was homeless, grieving my parents, and convinced my life was over. Then one day, a man stopped to listen. He didn't offer me money or pity. He offered me a chance. He told his story, the abbreviated version, but honest. The car accident, the guilt, the streets, George's invitation, the church's risk, the music outreach program, the failures and successes mixed together. "I'm not standing here to tell you I have it all figured out," Daniel said. "I don't. I still have days where I wake up sad, where I miss my parents so much it physically hurts, where I doubt whether I'm doing enough or being enough. But I've learned something these past months. We're not called to be perfect. We're called to be present, to show up for each other, especially in the messy, complicated, broken places." He picked up his guitar. "I wrote this song last week. It's called Building on Broken Ground. It's about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives become the foundation for something we never could have imagined." He began to play, his voice filling the sanctuary with a song about loss and hope, about falling and rising, about how grace meets us in our brokenness rather than demanding we fix ourselves first. "I built my house on broken ground, where all my dreams came falling down, but stone by stone and tear by tear, I'm finding solid footing here. Grace doesn't wait for me to mend, it meets me where I've been, and whispers, 'Child, begin again. On broken ground, I'm building still.'" As he sang, Daniel saw people crying, saw heads nodding, saw Christopher Wells sitting straighter in his wheelchair. He saw George smiling proudly, saw Pastor Jennings with his hand over his heart, and for the first time since his parents died, Daniel felt something he'd thought was lost forever. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. After the service, Dozens of people approached him. Some shared their own stories of loss and recovery. Others thanked him for his honesty. A few asked about volunteering with the outreach program. One elderly man waited until the crowd thinned, then approached slowly. "Young man, I lost my son to suicide 10 years ago. He was a musician, like you. I blamed myself, thought I'd failed him. I stopped going to church, stopped believing God cared. But hearing you today, you reminded me that broken doesn't mean worthless. Thank you for that." Daniel hugged him, both men crying openly. That afternoon, Daniel drove to the cemetery where his parents were buried. It was his first visit since the funeral. He'd been too afraid before, afraid of the pain, the finality, the guilt. He stood at their graves, guitar in hand, and told them everything. About the streets, about George, about the church, about the outreach program, about all the people he'd met and tried to help. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said finally, "but if you can, I want you to know I'm okay. Not perfect, not healed, but okay. And I'm trying to use what you gave me, the voice, the training, the values, to help other people. I hope that makes you proud. I hope you know that every time I sing, every time I connect with someone who's struggling, I'm carrying you with me." He played "Building on Broken Ground" there in the cemetery, his voice mixing with the wind through the trees. When he finished, he felt lighter somehow, not free of grief. That would never fully leave, but free of the crushing guilt that had paralyzed him. "I love you," he whispered. "I'll always love you, and I'll keep trying to make you proud." That evening, George called. "Hey, I have something I want to run by you. There's a songwriters showcase next month in Austin. Small venue, up-and-coming artists, industry people in attendance. I'd like you to perform "Building on Broken Ground" there. Get your song out into the world." "George, I'm not ready for that. I'm barely ready for church services. You're more ready than you think. And Daniel, it's time to stop thinking of yourself as the kid who lost everything. You're a musician now, a minister, someone who's building something beautiful from broken pieces. It's time to step into that." Daniel thought about his father's letter. Don't be afraid of your emotions. Let them shape you, teach you, make you more compassionate. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll do it. Attaboy. Your parents would be so damn proud of you." As Daniel hung up, he looked around his small apartment. No longer temporary housing, but actually home. He saw his guitar in the corner, his parents' Bible on the table, photos from outreach sessions on the wall. Evidence of a life rebuilt from ruins. He thought about Margaret Phillips's words, "Grief becomes part of you, not all of you." He thought about Christopher Wells fighting through physical therapy, about Ashley Bennett in recovery, about all the people at Morningside and Haven House and the VA hospital who'd become part of his extended family. He thought about George Strait, who'd seen potential in a homeless kid preaching on a street corner, about Pastor Jennings, who'd offered dignified work instead of charity, about Dorothy, who'd fed him and believed in him from day one. And he thought about his parents, whose love and investment in his gift had led him to this moment, even through the detour of grief and streets and brokenness. Daniel picked up his guitar and began to write a new song. This one wasn't about loss or recovery. It was about gratitude, about how sometimes the people who save us are strangers who become family, about how community can rebuild what tragedy destroys, about how grace shows up in unexpected forms, a country music legend stopping on a street corner, a church taking a risk, people choosing to believe in potential rather than circumstances. The song poured out of him, the melody natural, the words honest. When he finished, he recorded it and sent it to George with a simple message. "Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." George's response came immediately. "Thank you for having the courage to be seen. That's the harder part." Daniel smiled, set down his phone, and looked out the window at the San Antonio skyline. Somewhere out there, people were struggling, hurting, wondering if anyone cared. And tomorrow, he'd show up for them. With his guitar, his voice, his story, and the same grace that had been shown to him. Because that's what you do when you've been rescued from drowning. You learn to swim, and then you reach back into the water for the next person. Daniel went to sleep that night with peace in his heart, his parents' photos on his nightstand, and a future he'd never imagined but was learning to embrace. One honest note, one broken person, one moment of grace at a time.